I'm going to be reading again from Mind and Evolution as assessed through reviews of major texts. This time, Zoonomia by Erasmus Darwin, Charles Darwin's grandfather, 1794. Erasmus Darwin was a deist, quote, because causes are superior in power to effects, so as we trace the operations of nature from cause to cause, climbing up the links in these chains of being, so our idea of the power of the Almighty Creator becomes more elevated and sublime, till we ascend to the great source of all things. This is not the God of the Gospels, and his time scale is not that of the Bible. He speaks of living creatures existing for millions of generations. Note, this is 1794. Here in the first major publication on evolution, we find Erasmus having already arrived at many of the ideas we usually attribute to later evolutionists. He approaches how living creatures evolve by first looking at how they develop. He rejects the prevailing theory of preformationism, that in each embryo there's a miniature virtue of the creature ready to expand. As a good atomist, he sees the atomic nature of matter precludes the original embryo having come with a cascade of ever smaller embryos stored within it. Also, if creatures simply enlarged, that would preclude them from being able to regrow parts they lost, as a crab can regrow a lost claw. Instead, he says, quote, Monsieur Buffon, Count Buffon, has with great ingenuity imagined the existence of certain organic particles which are supposed to be partly alive and partly mechanic springs. Erasmus borrows that idea, referring to these springs as living filaments. What a great anticipation of the genome. He goes on to suppose that all living creatures originate in such filaments, an astonishing anticipation of how we think of development and evolution today, based on the genome. Erasmus begins his own account of development where Aristotle left off, with male semen acting as the principal template for each new life, a belief reinforced perhaps by microscope views of wriggling spermatozoa. All the information needed for building an adult creature comes from the male in the spermatozoa, he believed, the female supplying primarily what the male filament needs to go about its work. In our terms, this would be as if the male genome alone directed the growth of the new adult, the female influencing it only through cytoplasmic features rather as the embryo acquires from the egg its mitochondria. The male sperm, he says, acts on the female egg as a fiber rather as through a process of irritability and sensitivity to create glands, by which Erasmus seems to mean organs and tissues in general. Each gland then develops a fiber that induces the development of the next gland. The embryo acquires or makes new parts with new irritabilities as it advances in its growth. This is like thinking of it as a succession of chemical templates, each inducing the next, which is often assumed to be how development takes place today. Our initial pioneers, Linnaeus and Erasmus, do not regard species as fixed. Quote, and from hence, as Linnaeus has conjectured in respect of the vegetable world, it is not impossible but that a very great variety of species of animal which now tenant the earth, may have their origin from the mixture of a few natural orders, and that those animal and vegetable mules, hybrids, which could continue their species, have done so and constitute the numerous families of animals and vegetables which now exist. Erasmus first likens evolution to a physical process. All animals, therefore, I contend, have a similar cause of their organization originating from a single living filament, genome, endued indeed with different kinds of irritabilities and sensibilities, or of animal appetences, which exist in every gland and in every moving organ of the body, in each cell, and are as essential to living organizations as chemical affinities are to certain combinations of inanimate matter. That is, he starts by saying all animals have a similar cause of their organization originating from a single living filament, that I refer to the genome, and are as essential to living organizations as chemical affinities are to certain combinations of organic matter. He's thinking from scratch. He has no precedent for this. He's groping for concepts that he can use to express what he wants. Here, he repeats his living filament theory, but this time complements it with reference to his deist great source of all things. Would it be too bold to imagine that in the great length of time since the earth began to exist, perhaps millions of years, that all warm-blooded animals have arisen from one living filament, which the great first cause endowed with animality? Shall we conjecture that one and the same kind of living filament, genome, is and has been the cause of organic life? We'll find this resort to deism appearing decades later as Robert Chambers' primary mechanism of evolution in Vestiges of the Natural History of Creation. Erasmus isn't finished coming up with mechanisms for evolution. Here's the inheritance of inquired characteristics that we usually associate with the later published work of Lamarck. It's 15 years later. The ingenious Dr. Hartley, in his work on man, and some other philosophers, have been of the opinion that our immortal part acquires during this life certain habits or actions or sentiments which become forever dissoluble, continuing after death in a future state of existence. I would apply this ingenious idea to the generation of production of the embryon or new animal, which partakes so much of the form and propensities of the parent. Here he suggests ways parents acquire characteristics that they then pass on to their progeny. Here's a long quote. In its more advanced state, the fetus evidently possesses volition, as it frequently changes its attitude, and afterwards the power of volition contributes to change or alter parts of the body during its growth to manhood. From their first rudiment or primordium to the termination of their lives, all animals undergo perpetual transformations, which are in part produced by their own exertions in consequence of their desires and aversions, of their pleasures and their pains, or of irritations, or of associations, and many of these acquired forms of propensities are transmitted to their posterity, thus possessing the faculty of continuing to improve by its own inherent activity and of delivering down those improvements by generation to its posterity, world without end. He has very few antecedents to follow, fleeting references in France, Germany, but basically he's thinking this from scratch. He refers only to Aristotle. He's following Aristotle, and he does so on this passing on of characteristics to the male. He restricts this passing on to the male. The world has long been mistaken in ascribing great powers to the imagination of the female, whereas from this account of it, Aristotle, the great power of imagination in the act of generation belongs solely to the male. The imagination of the male at the time of copulation or at the time of the secretion of the semen may so affect the secretion by irritative or sensitive associations as to cause the production of similarity of form and features, as the motions of the chisel of the turner imitate or correspond with those of the ideas of the artist. Erasmus then prepares the ground for his grandson Charles' theory of natural selection. You're going to find it's all here. He first draws attention to how animals change in the course of domestication. The great changes introduced into various animals by artificial or accidental cultivation, great changes of shape and color, which we daily see produced in similar animals from our domestication of them as rabbits or pigeons. Then to how they respond to competition among them for scarce resources. Great want among animals is that of security, which seems much to have diversified the forms of their bodies and color of them. These consist in the means of escaping other animals more powerful than themselves. Another great want consists in the means of procuring food, which has diversified the forms of all species of animals. Some birds have acquired harder beaks to crack nuts, as the parrot, others for the softer seeds of flowers or the buds of trees, as the finches. Every individual tree produces innumerable seeds, and every individual fish innumerable spawn in such inconceivable abundance as would, in a short space of time, crowd the earth and the oceans with inhabitants. This argument only shows that the productions of nature are governed by general laws. There it all is. Charles's famous argument for natural selection, because in each new generation, more creatures are brought into existence than the environment has resources to sustain. Competition for these scarce resources will winnow out all but the fittest, those passing on to the next generation the characteristics making them fitter. For his general law, Charles had only to draw on the mathematics of Malthus. The bare bones of natural selection could hardly have been laid out more fully. In the second part of Zoonomia, Erasmus turns to medical conditions, cataloguing them by order, class, down to species, for each condition giving symptoms and a remedy. Notably, there's almost no science. Science hasn't existed yet in this area. It's a sobering reflection of how little was known about such matters just 200 years ago. However, the novel classification of diseases must have made this book very popular throughout Europe, carrying along with it the first part with its speculations about development and evolution. Pioneers following him tended to peel apart development and evolution, a process completed when his grandson Charles came up with a mechanism accounting for evolution alone. Recently, Erasmus's policy of considering evolution and development as driven by similar processes has been revived under the moniker Evo Devo. For this, check out my review of James Shapiro's Evolution: A View from the 21st Century. I don't think I've stressed enough how original Erasmus was. From only scattered references, sidelong references, he fixes on the idea of evolution and writes a 100-page account of it. Without having a body of concepts to draw on, he creates the concepts. And in doing so, he provides the ground for following thinkers to think about evolution. I feel that this book is enormously original, and there may be more ideas buried here that wouldn't be perceived for a century or so, but we might now think were worth restoring. Altogether, I think this is a great book and well worth reading.